So my plan tonight is to cover off a bit of practical advice mixed with some very romantic photos, because I feel like that sums up tiny living. It's a real mix of the very romantic with the not so romantic. So I'm going to try and balance them out just not to turn anyone off. So I grew up on a dairy farm. Ta-da! That's not my farm, but it's a generic picture of a farm. I grew up on a dairy farm, so I spent a lot of time outside. I felt pretty connected to nature, but also I guess I grew up in a family that was pretty resource conscious. I have pretty vivid memories of being in the bathroom and having a shower, and you'd get about 30 seconds into the shower and the knock on the door would come and my dad would be saying, "Okay, are you finished yet? Time to get out." And it has since instilled in me quite a strong level of water anxiety. So just like, don't wash the dishes around me because it just doesn't end well. But I think that's important as well, and that's really come in handy later in my life. So since then I also went travelling overseas, and I've kind of met lots of people from around the world and seen the different, I guess, levels of poverty and things that people live in, and the struggle that a lot of people have to access just basic resources around the world. And then I'm really conscious of the fact that in Australia we're really lucky. We're one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, and we don't always necessarily value that the way that we should. So after spending some time overseas and volunteering and things, I came back to Australia, and I felt that disconnect between the access to resources that we have and the way that we value them. That was quite challenging for me. And also, as I mentioned, I'm from the country, and when I came back home from overseas, I was also challenged by the fact that most people I went to school with and most people I grew up with who still lived in the country were settling down, getting married, buying a house, having kids. That's kind of what you do. Except I wasn't very interested in doing that, and I wasn't quite sure where that left me, because I wanted to have somewhere that I could live out my values of making less of an impact on the environment and not taking these resources for granted. And yet the only options that I really saw out there were houses in housing estates that are getting bigger by the day, and the land is getting smaller, and there's no backyard. And to me, all that really left room for was buying a house and filling it with stuff. And that just wasn't really something that I was interested in. So I was kind of stuck with this dilemma of wanting somewhere for myself and wanting somewhere that I could live the life I wanted to. I'd been living with my parents, I'd been living with other people, and there's only so many times you can remind your parents to take the green bags to the supermarket before they threaten to kick you out. So I had to kind of find a different solution. And it was at that point that I went camping for a weekend. Ta-ding! I went camping on a friend's property. Actually, it was her dad's property, yeah, that's it. And he unfortunately had lost his house in a bushfire and was building a new house. But in the meantime, while he was building this new house, he'd created this man shack. And it was kind of like half dairy that hadn't been burnt down, half carport that someone had driven up for him, half bits and bobs of everything that he'd found and managed to put together into this little shack. And I went and spent the weekend there, and I have really strong memories of this place. You know, there was a dunny built out on the hill looking out over the farm. There was a bath outside that had hot running water, and so I got to have like this hot bath under the cold starry sky that was just bliss. There was a sleeping loft in there out of necessity, there wasn't much room, and there was a potbelly stove. And I also remember him cooking pasta for us and like fishing this bit of tin that he'd found out of the shed that had holes in it and using it for a colander. And his daughter, my friend, was outraged. She's like, "Dad, what are you doing? Just buy a colander." And he's like, "Well, why? When I have this piece of tin that works perfectly fine." And I was just, like, that to me was a really life-changing point where I was like, wow, you can do anything with nothing, you know, you can really create something. And I think that was the time where it was, you know, to me it was a little bit like having a teenage crush. I just walked away from this and I was obsessed. I was like, that's the answer to what I want, like a home that I can live in and live simply, but I guess pursue what it is that I'm interested in. And so I went home from that weekend and I found this website called Cabin Porn, which is not what it sounds like, I promise you, but it is a really cool website, and it's full of shacks and cabins and houses all around the world, and they're really beautiful, and that's where I saw my first tiny house. That was nearly 4 years, actually. I found this photo, and it was from nearly 4 years ago. And when I saw the first picture of the tiny house, I thought, right, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. And there wasn't much sense to that decision because I didn't know how I was going to do it, and I didn't know if it was going to be a disaster, but I knew I was going to try. And there's a big gap between there and here, obviously, and I will talk to some of that, but I guess a series of very fortunate events have led me to be here sharing with you a beautiful house that I now have that has let me achieve some of those things. So it's a little less of a man shack, a little more of a house. Now I'm going to try and walk you through some of the specs of my house. And I might miss something, or I might go into too much detail about things, sorry, either way. But, so my house is built on a trailer that I had fabricated for this design. So it's 6.5 metres long and it's 2.8 metres wide, which is actually oversized technically for a trailer or for a tiny house. Most are 2.5 metres wide, mine's 2.8 metres wide. And I did that deliberately because I wanted extra space, and I didn't plan, and I don't plan on moving my house very much. So I can buy a temporary permit to shift the house, and I did that to shift the trailer, but it's not, I mean, I guess I can't register it the same way you would register a normal sized trailer. Pros and cons to that, I can't go into them tonight because I'm still learning about them, but yeah, keep an eye on my blog if you want to learn more about it. I think I will write a post about that. So yeah, so I have these beautiful double French doors that open up, and that leave me with a really nice space. There's still a few finishing bits to go. Don't look too closely, Tom. I haven't finished that yet. But as you can see, I've got solar panels on the top. I do have a rainwater tank. Do you want to go again, Katie? And so inside, I've got a sleeping loft up the top, and that's above my kitchen. I have stairs that run down this side. This couch here is a folds out into a giant double bed, actually. You can definitely sleep at least 3 people on there. And I have storage underneath the couch, which was really important. Go again. Just a few pictures of the inside. So I built the stairs. The measurements weren't quite what I'd planned, but they work. And there's plenty of room for storage underneath, which is really nice. I was tossing up originally about a ladder versus stairs, and after climbing up and down a ladder for months whilst building, I decided very quickly I was not going to have a ladder. And whenever I have to get up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet, I'm very happy with my choice to have stairs. So I do have a wood fire combustion oven in my house. I can cook on the top of it, it heats my house, and I also have an oven underneath so I can bake in it when the fire's going for the right amount of time at the right heat, which is still a mystery to me. The fire itself is actually designed to heat a space that's about 90 square metres, and my house is probably closer to 20. So whenever the fire's going, all of the windows in the house are open, but that's okay. I don't get cold in winter at all. I do get hot in summer, and I haven't worked out an answer to that yet, but that's just life. I also have a bathroom in the house. So this is a shower that I kind of made up out of leftover bits of tin from the outside skirt around my house that works really well, and that's my kitchen that runs along there. And I also have a compost toilet, which is in the bathroom. So this is an airhead compost toilet, and this is where you've got to be careful because I could talk for hours about toilets, and I realised I probably shouldn't. But quick overview is it has a diverter at the front, so all the liquids go into the front bucket, all the solids go into the back bucket. The liquids I just empty whenever that gets full, and if, depending on how many people are in the house, that happens once to twice a week, or if you have visitors, a lot quicker. The solids bucket actually, so just like secretly, turns out poo is mostly water, amazing. And I have this ventilation fan that runs constantly through the solids bucket, and it dries out a lot of the liquid in the poo. So the volume in that bucket actually shrinks pretty quickly, amazingly. So depending on how many people are in the house using the bucket, it can actually go up to 2 months, maybe more than 2 months without being emptied, because it's constantly composting in the toilet and drying out as it goes, which is cool. So it's not as icky as you think, because by the time you do empty it, it's actually a lot closer to composted soil already than poo. So that's a cool fact. I'll stop there and we'll move on from the toilets. What comes next? Oh yes, so this is where when the bucket does get full, or when it's time to just have a fresh bucket, I take it outside and I empty it into its own compost bin outside where it breaks down for another 12 months, and that's mostly just to make sure that there are no pathogens left in it, and then once that's been composting for another 12 months, I can then use it basically as compost in the ground, on the garden, and it's perfectly harmless. And it takes a lot less than 12 months to already look like compost and soil. It's amazing, but that's just what I've been told to do for safety, so that's what I do. Anything else? I have, most of my windows are double glazed. I run a standard fridge, a soft 240 volt power. So I have solar panels, which we didn't see, but you will see them. So I have solar panels that go down into my batteries that come into the house, and that powers all of my electrics. I have an instant gas hot water system that runs off a 9 kilo LPG gas bottle that I've had since June last year and have not had to change. So that's working pretty well. I did look at lots of other things like hot water jackets and solar hot water and all of those things, but it kind of got too expensive, too hard, too heavy, lots of things. So in the end I went for the instant gas hot water, and it's worked a treat. So I'm really happy with that. Yeah, I think that's most of the logistics. Okay, so on to the advice. So I guess there's lots of advice, but there's also, I guess, some realities that I just want to talk about before we come back to all of my ideals that I dreamt about for the tiny house. And one of them that I want to talk about, but I might come back to in a little minute, is the budget, because budgets can be unpredictable and tricky to budget for. But just broadly speaking, I wanted to start off by saying something about this idea of tiny houses as a way to get into the property market. So there are lots of people doing lots of really interesting things. I just met someone earlier tonight doing interesting things. But I think the thing about tiny houses is that sometimes the conversations around them can be a bit misleading. So I've had a lot of people approach me and talk to me about how tiny houses are the solution for millennials to get into the property market, they're the solution to homelessness, they're a solution for all of these things. And I don't necessarily think that that's true yet. Maybe one day it might be. Maybe Narelle has some things to say about that. I won't put you on the spot. But in terms of the financial side of things, it was the right decision for me. But that's also partly because of what I said earlier about not being interested in the lifestyle that went along with maybe buying one of those houses in a housing estate. But at the same time, when you look at the fact that I spent somewhere between $40,000 and $45,000 on this house, like that's probably enough for a deposit somewhere on a house. And the thing that I'd like to just put in people's minds, I think, is that you have to think about where you want to be or where you might be in 5 to 10 years. So in 5 years or so, I will have spent the amount of money on this house that I maybe would have spent on rent in the same time. And in that case, maybe I've come out even, maybe a little bit better because I've got something to show for the end of it. But if I'd spent that money on a deposit in a house, I would have had something that would have increased in value. You know, like there are pros and cons to both sides, and I think it's not as simple as saying that tiny houses are a way to get around buying property. And I think it's unfair to say that about people who choose to do it as well. That's just kind of just a general thought I wanted to put out there. Another thing that I think can be a little bit misleading is my house is off-grid. And so the first thing that pops into people's heads usually when I talk about being off-grid is that I don't pay any bills. And that's true, I don't pay any bills. I don't pay an electricity bill, I don't pay a water bill, because my electricity comes from solar and my water comes from my roof, my rainwater tank. But at the same time, I spent about $5,000 installing my off-grid solar system. And I spoke to one of my friends who lives in a tiny house just yesterday, and I asked her how much she pays for electricity, because her and her partner live in a tiny house and they pay for electricity through the main house on the property that they live. So she said they spend about $100 a month on internet and electricity. I mean, I don't use much power in my house. My electric bills would not be much. They would not be $100 a month. But let's say $100 a month, that's like 4 years-ish, 4 or 5 years of paying bills before I've made my money back on being off-grid. So I chose to do that for environmental reasons, but it's not always going to be the best choice financially if that's all you're after. So I think when you also include things like maintenance for my house, like now I'm a homeowner, same as any homeowner, there's upkeep. you know, I've just gotten around to finishing one round of building, I've got to go back and revarnish all of the outside of my house because it's all like been worn down by the sun, and there's always more things to do. Like owning a home just costs money. So I think it's just important not to simplify it too much by saying that off-grid tiny houses means you'll live debt-free forever. Not always, not necessarily the case. The other thing I wanted to talk about, which may be useful, is, oh look, there's my solar panels. That was my slide for the off-grid bit. Yeah, please go again. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was new versus second-hand materials, because I also know that a lot of people who want to build a tiny house really aspire to mostly use second-hand materials. I know I did. And for some people that works really, really well. You can save money, you can save money, and you can save producing more things that then go out into the environment, and that's awesome. But something someone said to me at the start of this build that rang very true throughout the whole thing was you either have money or you have time. So for me, I was working full-time for a year whilst this building project was happening, and I had Tom on board helping me build, and we would have weekends designated to certain parts of the build. So I had Tom arriving on Saturday morning, ready to help me start building, and we needed to have stuff there ready to build with. And I'd worked all week, and then come home ready to build. I didn't have time to be driving around, scoping out these secondhand materials. I didn't have any way to transport them if I found them. And I actually went to the tip once or twice, and I looked at the stuff in the tip, and I'm like, well, that's a window, but I don't know if it'd work. And if it doesn't work, I don't know how to fix it to make it work. So, you know, I think the secondhand materials thing can be really great, but you do need to have time. You need to have some way to get things around, whether you have a trailer or a truck, or you have someone you can borrow it from, and you need to know what to do with them once you get them, and you need to have somewhere to store them, which I also didn't have anywhere to put them. If I'd collected all these things, I had nowhere to leave them until we were ready to build. So kind of by default, I don't know what's next, but we'll go to the next one. Kind of by default, I mostly ended up using new materials in the build. Later on, I was able to focus on secondhand stuff, mostly for my furniture. So the wood fire oven was secondhand. My kitchen bench was actually from the farm that I grew up on, which was really cool. And there were a few other things like that I was able to find secondhand to save money and also to not have to buy new things. But in the end, secondhand didn't work for me. So just keep that in mind, that it can be a nice idea, but sometimes in reality, it doesn't always work. Next one. So the other thing so these were all the things that really went through my mind before I started building. Do I do this? Do I do this? Do I do this? Do I do this? And the other big one that I read a lot about was paying for professional help or doing it all yourself. So I do know a few people who have really stuck it out and built a whole house themselves, and power to them, I do not know how, and they've made a beautiful house. But I came up with this idea on my own. My family, I don't know anyone who builds. I don't know anyone who could give me practical advice. And I was really lucky to have a conversation with Tom right at the start, and it worked out that we could do this at the start together. So I had a design and a bit of an idea of what I wanted, and I will just give a quick shout out to Soul House Design. So a lot of the ideas from my design came from Vina Lustato, which if any of you have seen her designs, they're very beautiful, and you should have a look. But I was able to take what I'd drawn on paper and the kind of measurements and the ideas that I had, and I took them to Tom, and he was able to say, with a bit of experience and a bit of knowledge behind it, that, okay, well this part will work, this part might not work so well, let's try this instead, and able to take those ideas and actually apply them to reality, which was really helpful. And then once we actually got into the build, there were lots of advantages to that as well. So having someone who could transport materials, who knew where to buy them, who knew what to buy, and had an idea of what the budget I should have been looking at was. Working with Tom and working with professionals definitely upped my budget, but I'm quite happy to say that's because my original budget was quite unrealistic. And what I ended up spending on the house, proportionally, what I got for my money was a lot more than what I would have got if I'd spent $20,000 trying to do it myself. I would have had the first picture of the shack. No offense to the shack, it's beautiful, but you know, this is something different. So, particularly for someone who was working on my own, having someone else and being able to pay someone to come in and just with skills and experience was really invaluable for me. It's hard, like it's hard work trying to build a house. I don't know if anyone's done it before, not even a tiny house, but just a normal house. Like there are lots of decisions to be made all the time. I didn't know this until I tried to build this house. And you've got to like choose colours, and you've got to choose materials, and you've got to call people, and you have to know what you're saying when you call them. And I didn't know any of these things. And it's not just hard work, it's tiring. It's really tiring, particularly when you're working all of the time and you don't have someone to share those decisions with. It's hard work. So making the decision for me, to pay for professional help was a really good decision, and I would certainly do that again. So I also had a plumber and electrician come and do the plumbing and the electrics for me. Like I say, just trying to Google enough words to have a conversation with these people, let alone trying to do it myself, like that was hard work. So I was really happy to pay someone who came to come in and know. On the flip side, I've since learnt that just because someone's a professional doesn't always mean they know what's best for your house. And you do have to be well informed enough to know what they're saying and know what you want. Because if you don't know what you're after, you can easily take someone's advice without knowing where that fits with what you want. So I'd certainly encourage people to access professional help if they need it, but know what you want before you do that as well. Yeah. I think the only other thing I want to say about the realistic side of things is that tiny houses are still in a little bit of a grey area. So I'm not going to go into this too much, but it's definitely a question I get asked about a lot in terms of where do I sit with councils, all of this kind of stuff. Like, I mean, to be honest, we're just in a bit of a grey area still, because we don't fall directly under definitions that there's legislation for. No one said we can't specifically do this out loud directly yet, but no one's made room for us to do it yet either. And so that kind of comes back to my original point about tiny houses versus maybe the property market. Like, I'm not a big fan of our housing system in general, but I think you do have to be realistic about the fact that you're taking a gamble if you decide to build and live in a tiny house. There's no guarantee that someone's not going to knock on my door tomorrow and make my life really hard. You know, there might be other ways around it, and that's partly why it's on a trailer, and I'm making sure I've always got options, but it's always, there's a bit of insecurity with that, you know, and that's inherent in deciding to go down this path. You just have to kind of, I spent a long time trying to call councils, trying to read things, like I wanted to do things by the book if I could. And it got to the point where I couldn't take the next step if I was waiting any longer to know how to do it by the book. So I have now embraced the insecurity of my situation, and I'm going to make the most of it while I have it, which is also why I wanted to be here tonight. But I just reality check, there is insecurity and a bit of anxiety in that sometimes if you're going to live in it. Anyway, okay, that's enough reality. Go back to the romance. You can leave it there, Katie, thanks. So that's kind of the reality side of things, but like I said earlier, there's a lot of ideals built into it for me. And I think that there's also a lot that you can take away from tiny houses, even if you don't live in one, and even if you don't want to live in one. Because for me, there's the tiny house movement, and there's a real ethos as part of that. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with that, and it's things like minimalism, it's things like slow living, it's all of these discussions we have. But I think what it boils down to for me is it's less stuff and money, more time and connection. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for when or what a lot of people see maybe in tiny houses, which is really cool. So I'm not sure I'd exactly call myself a minimalist. This is the cleanest, like those photos you saw was a day's worth of cleaning and hiding stuff. It doesn't always look like that, I promise you. But there are a few things that I have also experienced in the last 12 months that I think are really cool that I wanted to talk to you about. I'll skip some of them. But I think one of the big things is all this talk about money. I think it's not always about money, and it's not all about money. And I think something that I'm realising now, so I quit my full-time job when I when I got the build to a stage that I could move in, and I now work 3 days a week in a job that I really love. And the arrangement that I have with my family for where my tiny house is I don't pay rent. And a lot of people are like, oh my God, you're so lucky, you have family, you don't pay rent. It's like, yes, well, that's true. Okay, no disputing that. I am very lucky, I agree. But I work 3 days a week, And that means I have 2 days a week to contribute to my family in ways that are not financial. So my family have 3 young kids, and both parents are working full-time, which means having one other person to take the kids to school, to pick them up from school, to start dinner when meetings run late, to do the ballet run, to be there, to babysit, to give someone a break. Like, that to me is actually far more valuable than what I could contribute in money. And I think that's the conversation we also need to start having around the fact that I can do that for my family, but it also means I now have 2 days a week where I get to volunteer in my community. I get to spend time with my family and friends, and I get to contribute to other people's lives in ways that don't revolve around money. You know, so much of our conversations just come down to money, and I think there's much more to that, and I hope that the tiny house movement can be a bit of a catalyst for us to have more of those conversations, because they're very important. God, there's so much I could say about all of this, like slow living, you know, like the cost of convenience. Sometimes I regret how inconvenient I've made things for myself in my house. You know, I'm human, I come home from work sometimes in winter and it's cold and it's dark, and I'd just like to put some 2-minute noodles in the microwave, but I don't have a microwave and I don't have 2-minute noodles. I have to sit in front of my fire and light it and wait until it heats up hot enough to cook something. And sometimes that's challenging, but I also love that I haven't built those easy options into my house, because it means I have to try harder. It means I have to try and be better. And I think it's important for us to recognise that lots of those convenience options take away the connection that we're looking for. And it makes us take for granted the time that we want to have. You know, sometimes it's there, it's just we want to bypass it. We want to skip past it and get to the good bits. And I think sometimes we miss the good bits by trying to skip through it. Obviously, one of the other things I love about talking about is resources. So, you know, I chose to live off-grid because I wanted to be environmentally friendly, but something I didn't expect was the really strong connection I feel now to the resources that I use and the waste I produce, and the way I can influence that relationship to be less extractive and more regenerative. You know, so it's interesting when I have friends over and it's sort of like, okay, well, it's a cloudy day today, so no toast till tomorrow, sorry. Or it's going to rain tomorrow, so I can indulge and have a 3-minute shower instead of a 30-second shower. You know, they're little things that I'm really conscious of now all of the time, not in a way that's a burden, but in a way that makes me appreciate what I do have. And I think that's really cool. Oh, we should probably keep sliding. I forgot I had more slides. So there's my little nephew hanging out in the garden, doing the cool things that we get to do together. Let me go one more, please. I think there's just, and like these are the things I get to do now. You know, I have friends come over for parties for the sake of having a party and eating food that we grew in the garden and, you know, just hanging out. It's really nice. And I think that's one more really unexpected thing that came from this project is the community that has built through it and around it. So there hasn't really, I mean, I talk about doing it on my own, but since I started the build, there wasn't really one weekend that I haven't had amazing people like Katie come out to my house and help me. And, you know, all of them would say, I've never built anything in my life, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like, you're in great company, we'll Google it together. And just having one other person there to help you, it takes the load off, but it also invites other people in to be part of this conversation and this journey, and people love that. And so much of it for me, so much of this for me is more about the space that we've been able to create. So in some ways the house is actually secondary to all of the other things that have come from the house, because we've been able to build a community, conversations, space to learn, space to connect, and just space to be in a place where we can live our values and have conversations and start influencing things. And so I guess that's part of what I wanted to say to you tonight, is that I realise that some of you will never build a tiny house and probably don't deep down want to, but I don't think you have to build a tiny house or live in a tiny house to take some of the best bits away from it, because that's why it's a movement. There's so much more to it. So, I mean, look, I think there's one more. And this is what we do now on the weekends. I had a working bee a couple of weekends ago where I just got all my friends in and we laid the floorboards in my house, and then because we'd taken all of the furniture out to lay the floorboards in, we just had a massive sleepover. And it's great, like, this is the things I get to do now. This is my adult life, it's all I ever dreamed of. And so I guess on that note, I'm really lucky in that building the tiny house did achieve those goals that I had at the start of creating a space where I get to live my values and still have a safe space to call home and come back to. You know, if I want to go travelling and things, I'm assuming I can leave my house where it is and come back to it. And it's nice to have that nest. That's really important. But more than that, I got a lot more out of the process than I bargained for as well. So I wanted to say that just by being here tonight, you may not agree, but I think just by being here tonight, you are already part of the tiny house movement, because for me, it's much more about having an interest in assessing the lives that we want and how do we make our housing fit that, rather than the other way around. So I hope that there is something that you can take away from it. And if you are going to go down the track of tiny housing, then go for it. Hopefully there's something useful that we can also contribute. But if you'd like to know anything more about anything that I've brushed over very quickly and you haven't seen it already, I have been writing a blog basically for dummies since I started, because a lot of it was just my own research trying to understand it. So if you haven't had a look at tinygolightly.com, there is plenty more information about all of these things on it. And if you're into the social media thing, then please jump on and find me and chat to me, because I'm still learning about a lot of it myself. And a lot of these ideas are just evolving as I talk about them and as I go through them. And I'd love to hear everyone else's perspective. So please do get in touch and have a chat. And I'm going to stop talking so that you can ask questions about things you want to talk about. So thank you.
Okay, Tom the builder has, not Bob the builder, Tom the builder, it has just asked if he can have about 5 minutes just to explain some things. So, thank you, Tom.
I'm going to try and put a really practical swing on this for those who are genuinely about to or have started on their own tiny house. I've got some ways you can get started, because it's very daunting. I know a lot of people start by collecting recycled materials and gathering up in a big heap. Please don't. It's not a good way to start. You'll end up, one, with a big hoard of stuff that you may not be able to do anything with. You may end up selling it on at the end. You could end up using up some favours for people that have let you keep their stuff. You may end up designing your house around things that you gathered at the start, not knowing what they were really going to be used for or how you're going to do it. Please don't go down that track. I've got some ways you can start without doing that. Tools and skills are far more valuable than materials. When the building process happens, materials arrive on site when you need them, not before. Tools and skills are what's more important. So ways you can gather that up. If you've got, firstly, you're going to need some power tools. You're going to need them. Get yourself a nail gun. That sounds deadly. It's not. They have tiny little nail guns, staple guns, all pneumatic powered, and they can do amazing things for you. They can speed up the build like you wouldn't believe. Sarah's house we built to lock-up stage in about 12 days. Not in a row, over 3 months. And that's in part because of the tools that we use to do that. Get them, practice using them. Build a doghouse. Doghouses are essentially houses. They're built, use studs, use rafters, put windows in, put doors in, paint it, sell it at the end and get your materials back. Get the price that you put into it, get that money back. You've gained skills, you've gained knowledge, you've gained photos you can show to people and get comments and whatever. You can get likes on Facebook if that's your thing. Build a cubby house. Cubby houses have floors. Hang some doors. Put an actual window in it. Practice waterproofing windows. Then again, you can sell that and get your money back so that you can build something else. Model building. Model building has gone way out of fashion, probably because of the technology-based 3D designs and whatnot, which are so accessible and so accurate. Models have great advantages to being able to learn the construction process. They have to be built in a very similar manner. If you were to build a model using a stud wall and using rafters on the inside and trimming it up with architraves and so on, you can learn the materials that you need. You can get some really good material lists and schedules off that. You can see the size, you can play with the layout of it. You can do that in a bedroom where you may not have the room to build a tiny house. You can definitely build a tiny house model. You could potentially, if it's a viable option, sell that as well and get your money back out of it. But I would imagine you'd hold on to it. After that, maybe you're ready to build a tiny house. What are you going to need? You're going to need a lot of space. You can park a tiny house in a much smaller area than you can build it. And that's really important. I do see people attempting to build a tiny house in a little suburban driveway. It's not a good idea. You're going to annoy people. You're going to run out of room to put up a ladder. You need about 2 metres around the outside of a construction, really, to do it comfortably. 3 if possible. You're going to need that to set up the scaffold. You might have seen photos there with scaffold on the outside, ladders. You need flat space. You also need fall zones. That's for safety as well. Speak to your neighbours, wherever that is that you're building. Speak to your neighbours. Make sure they know about it. Make sure they're on board. If they're not on board with you building an illegal tiny house, probably don't do it. I couldn't imagine getting halfway through a tiny house, having a frame and being told to move it. You don't have any legs to stand on, really. So get them on board, or if they're not, look for a plan B. That is really important. I can't really stress that enough, actually. A lot of arguments regarding building, and building causes a lot of arguments. They almost always come from the neighbours. Build safety. In a regular house build, a lot of the safety is regulated. And you have regulators. You have building surveyors. You have potentially WorkSafe could turn up. So you've got tradesmen that have experience and builders that are responsible for the safety, and it's their job to make sure it happens. When you take on a building project on your own, same with the regulations, when you take them on, you've got to make sure it happens in a safe manner. Tools cost a lot, you don't want to be breaking them. Fingers cost even more, you don't want to have to stitch them back on. Ladders are the easiest way to hurt yourself. If you don't have experience using ladders, you might want to start small and get bigger and not go for a 4 metre high tiny house. That is potentially a very deadly accident should you slip off that. 4 metres high, it's taller, especially with a pointy roof like on Sarah's. It's taller and more deadly than an actual house build, which is very well regulated. Anything over 3 metres on a domestic site in Victoria needs to have a handrail around it. And anything below that needs to have a 2 to 3 metre fall space to fall into. So you need to take that on and be very serious about it. Obviously tools. Well, I mentioned nail guns earlier. They are fantastic in terms of the time that they can save and the finish that they can achieve. I have had 6 nails in my body from nail guns. They hurt. Although the pain did fade and the injuries were not permanent. Circular saws, I'm thankful I've never had an injury with a circular saw. You would be looking at it. They would be here, it would be visible. Please don't underestimate that. Ladders, top of the list for injuries on building sites and at home. Please don't take this project on lightly. Yeah, that can happen. Design safety, I heard electricians and plumbers mentioned earlier. You want to get your tickets for that. Should the day come that you need to get it insured, they're going to ask for that. I don't think it's possible at the moment, but if it is possible, they'll be asking for those tickets, and it's real. House fires happen. We live in a world now that doesn't really have house fires. That's as a result of a lot of arbitration involved around construction to make sure that they happen properly. Really simple things like smoke alarms have been mandatory in houses for a long time. And they're not mandatory in tiny houses because no one's making sure it happens. That's up to you to do that. Smoke alarms, fire extinguishers, fire blankets, emergency escapes from a loft. Possibly not mandated in Australia, but in a lot of places in the world, a second story would have to have an emergency exit in case of fire. And in the case of Sarah's and a lot of tiny houses, you've got a wood fire between the only exit and the loft where you're sleeping. It's potentially a very deadly trap. Tiny houses usually built out of timber, and usually really light timber, which burns really quickly. It is a thought that I do struggle with a bit. They are little tinder boxes, basically. So you need to be really careful when designing them and when building them. Stairs, another area, a huge grey area for construction of tinies, because you just don't have room. for the very well-regulated stairs to fit. So you have extra big, extra steep stairs. In this photo here, with no handrail. Yeah, right. Hand grips, handrails, they're actually for coming down the stairs or for falling off the top more than they are for climbing up. I come from the playground industry where hand grips are very well mandated, but with a hand grip you can get away with a lot as well. So you can get away with these regulations by changing them if you use some common sense. But some sort of rails and hand grips are almost essential. It's not for when you're fit and healthy and alert and awake and the sun's out. It's for when you're drunk. Not now. When you're half asleep and you're coming down the stairs, when it's dark, when you've got people over that aren't used to it, kids, that's when those safety aspects really come in. And please don't put your stove at the bottom of the stairs. Should speak for itself, but it doesn't always. For those involved in tiny house culture, you've no doubt looked at YouTube. There are some things I want to point out very quickly. Americans have enormous everything. If you've ever been there, the first thing you'll notice is that the cars are huge. Your average car could tow about 6 tonne on the road. And you can do that because their roads are huge as well. If you had a car in Australia that could tow on a 4 tonne tiny, you wouldn't find anywhere to park it. That's a serious thing to consider, whether you can get your hands on that kind of gear to tow your tiny, and what you're going to do with it when you've got it. So please consider that. Also, American prices, you might hear a lot of things being thrown around in American dollars. The exchange rate is obvious in that, but what's not as obvious is that the trade skills that Americans have are much poorly paid, much lower paid over there than they are here. So if you have to hire tradespeople, they say they paid a tradesman $10,000 to build it. It's probably 30 grand here. That money's not in my pocket, someone ended up with it. Be careful of that. Terminology is also terrible. Imperial measurements, yeah. And a lot of just basic terminology is very different. If you're wondering why you can't buy a skill saw in Bunnings, they're called circular saws here. They also overbuild a lot of their tiny houses. That's for snow load, hurricanes, tornadoes. We don't have them. That's why you might see them being built incredibly strongly. Doesn't need to happen here. Caravan manufacturer, if you've ever looked at it, they build with a 1-inch thick wall, timber wall, the 2x1 on its edge. Whereas here in America, for instance, you might see 4x2 being used as studs, or even 6x2. I don't know why they do that. But you just don't need that here. We do have bushfire. We don't have hurricanes, we do have bushfire. That's a problem. I don't want to go in there. That's a huge problem. I'm building right now, legally, for bushfire, and it's a horrible thing to think of what a tiny house doesn't comply with. All the natural defences you have for bushfire on a house, you cannot put in a tiny house due to weight restrictions, price restrictions. Naturally, they have an empty space underneath them, which is the first thing you take away when trying to build a bushfire-proof home. So please consider that. You're going to have to take that on yourself. When building windows, double French doors facing north. That's why this house gets hot really quickly. It's great during winter, but there's no eave, which is a natural defence against summer sun on a house. So you don't have that. It's very easy to achieve light into a house, and also windows actually work only when it's light outside and you're inside. It's a very small fraction of the day. Go outside, people. It's fun outside when it's light. You don't need very many. I don't know why there's so many tiny houses, half the number, half the size. You only need about 10% of the floor space of the house to be in window. If your door is glass, that's most of what you need. So those French doors there cover the entire legal need for light space in your house. Yeah, no. I disagree with a lot of people on that actually, but 3 or 4 windows is plenty. 3 windows plus a glass door. Windows add weight, time, money. They destroy your thermal efficiencies during winter and in summer. Please be aware of that and try to reduce them. Recycled materials, we touched on it quickly. Yeah, structural capacity, weight, time, there's a lot of unknowns around it. If you have to pay someone like me to use them, it's going to cost you more. Very quickly your budget is going to go above what it would have been had you built from new materials. I know there's ideals around it. I would suggest using sustainably acquired materials rather than insisting upon recycled materials. It's great if you can use it, but please don't insist upon it. It will end up costing you weight on your trailer, and if you have to rework the mechanics or if you have to buy a bigger trailer because you used recycled materials, any environmental impact you were trying to reduce, you've blown out of the water. You've lost that because you had to put in an extra axle, which costs the environment dearly.
Hi guys, quick question for both Sarah and Tom. What are your thoughts on timber versus steel frames and also acrylic windows versus glass? Yes, no, advantages, disadvantages?
Steel frames can be great. Personally, I'm a timber purist, so I would always go with the timber first. Steel is very light. They have a mandatory 90 mil, I believe. I don't know if you can get 70 mil frames. If you can, that would be fantastic. I tend towards 70 mil studs, timber or steel if it's possible. Steel will add a great deal of time to your build. They're put together with drills rather than nail guns, and everything that you fix to it has to be screwed on. That's the major point for me, is the time that it would add to it. Perspex and glass, there's no real reason to go away from glass that I know of. Glass is incredibly strong these days and very accessible. I'm not one for building my own windows. I can do it. I wouldn't. If you had a choice, please go and get pre-purchased windows. Save you a lot of time and potentially a lot of leaks. A leaking window could cost you dearly because it could rot out the frame that you put in. Not really worth the risk. If you can get Perspex windows in the same manner that you can get glass, then I don't see why you couldn't use it. But there's no, I've driven tiny houses, there's no chance of them breaking. They're incredibly well braced, which I should have mentioned earlier. Bracing is more important than downforce on a tiny house, which is how they differ from most houses. So as long as you brace it fine, you shouldn't have a problem with that.
Thank you both for your talks. Could you just quickly say, do you cook on fire in the summer? And secondly, can you capture enough water to sustain yourself? And thirdly, if I may, do you have any insight into the regulations around your composting loo system? Like I've heard the sort of 300-day regulation, and then it's sort of pathogen free, but if you had any thoughts on that, I'd be interested.
Yes. No, I do not cook on the fire in the summer because I would die. I was cooking for quite a long time on a Trangia stove inside because I had a little hiking stove that I ran off methylated spirits, and that got me through most of the summer until I just went out and bought a gas stove that is, it's still a camping stove, but it's actually a cast iron stove that now sits on top of, oh, you can see it in this picture. Look, here it is, this tiny little thing. Good pickup. So it's a cast iron stove that sits on here that runs down to a second LPG bottle that I have outside. So we drilled a hole through the yellow tongue flooring and sent the gas line outside and have the gas bottle under there and tested everything 5 times, so there's no gas leaking, I promise. But that works much, much better, obviously, than a Trangia stove. Secondly, I have, so you would have seen that I have a tiny little rainwater tank on the front of my drawbar. And that was me doing some quick calculations and estimating that 600 litres of water should be plenty. Turns out a 600 litre tank is tiny, like I could pick that up with one hand. I had no idea how many litres 600 litres were until it showed up on my doorstep. But having said that, so then I got a second tank, and the overflow from that runs into my second tank, and the second tank is 1,050 litres, and I have not gotten below halfway on my 600 litre tank. I don't shower as much as regular people, I've been told. I don't do laundry in my house, and the toilet doesn't take any flush water, But having said that, I don't use extremely small amounts of water. Like, I don't go out of my way to use no water at all. And so far I've had no problems with the amount of water that I've had in my tank to date. For house usage only. I don't water the garden with the tank. Composting toilet, do you mean regulations from like a council point of view, or do you mean from a health point of view? The only, I tried to have conversations with council about this, my council, not this council, and there weren't a lot of helpful discussions to be had, except that apparently there are certain compost toilets that are approved by the EPA that you can use, but they tend to be the giant ones that have to have the underground canisters that are then taken out and shifted. And not only do you have to, are supposed to have an approved compost toilet, but you then need to have the council come and approve where you put the approved toilet, which for me was in an unapproved house. So I kind of skipped those steps and read the Humanure handbook instead, which, you know, I've kind of gotten from various sources, the 12-month thing. I don't know any technical stuff about it, just that I'm trying to be safe. So it all goes in there, and I haven't taken anything out yet. So yes.
Thanks for your talk. Space is a premium in the tiny houses, obviously. What do you do regarding insulation?
Well, mine's insulated, but Tom can probably say something more useful than that.
That one there's got earth wool in it. That's got a 2.5 R rating. 2.5 you could squish into as low as 45 mil in, say, a floor space or a roof space, which we absolutely did. In a wall, yeah, 70 mil. Is pretty good. I said a caravan has an inch thick wall. I don't know what they squeeze into that. It's obviously not as well insulated. But tiny houses are very well insulated when they're all sealed up. There's only that one room. There's no real leaks in it. 70 mil is tons for that kind of thickness. I actually squeezed an R5 insulation vat into a 90 mil wall. It was a bit tight. Don't do that. They do. So it was not actually as helpful as I would have liked. It was actually a purchase mistake, I'll admit to that. Yeah, even so, yeah, those little houses, when they're insulated floor, roof, walls, and if you haven't put too many windows in it, they're incredibly well insulated.
Yes, my house gets hot. And it doesn't get cold, obviously, because you've seen the giant fire. But it actually, yeah, in terms of insulation, it does pretty well. I mean, I do have curtains that cover my giant windows to keep some of the sun out. But even on a really hot day, it will stay cool until about 1 o'clock in the day before it gets too hot and I have to vacate. And then as soon as it cools down outside, I can open it up. And because I have lots of windows, I get an excellent cross breeze that cools my house down very quickly. Hey. Anyway, so yes, it is pretty well insulated. It's small, so inevitably it's going to get hot and cold at some point. But for what it is, the insulation works pretty well.
I'm curious about the practicality of it. I love the concept in theory, but in practice, how is it living in such a small space?
The size of the space is absolutely the least of the things that I notice. I mean, one of the first things people often say when they come to my house is, "Oh my God, it's so big, it's not actually tiny," which is kind of hurtful. Like, as a tiny house, as a person who identifies as a tiny houser, don't say that to me. But there is plenty of space. Like, and that's one of the reasons that I am glad that I went with the oversize width. I have been in some houses where you have kitchen on this side and kitchen on that side, or stairs on this side, and it's very narrow, and you kind of feel like you can't turn around one side, or you can't have someone walk behind you. Whereas I often, you know, I've got lots of different space. That was one thing I was worried about, that there weren't any closed doors that I could shut off and say, okay, I'm leaving my bedroom now, I'm going to the kitchen, or I'm leaving my home office and now I'm going to the bedroom. I worried that it would all blend into one space and it would feel like I never got to go anywhere different. But I don't find that, actually. I actually have lots of room, and this couch is spacious. I don't have somewhere to eat yet. This little crate is not a very helpful table. That's on my to-do list, get a table. But, you know, I have lots of room to cook, can eat here. You can open the doors and it feels huge. Up in the loft, even with this gable roof at the end, it's not pokey at all. And a lot of that's to do with the extra width, but also, I guess, just not having too much stuff in there. Yeah, in terms of the actual size of it, I know people who have lived in smaller apartments. You know, this would be bigger than a bedsit apartment. I know people who lived in cupboards in Paris. You know, this is not, it doesn't feel like a small space, aside from sometimes a lack of places to put things, but that's probably because I have too much stuff.
The main thing that I wanted to say is come and talk to council. There's a number of areas that you would need to talk to, including planning, building, environmental health and our local laws, and it really, I guess it's not a simple question to answer in terms of what are the regulations and requirements around tiny homes, so you would need to come and have a one-on-one chat with us about your individual circumstances and what you're planning to do. And the advice that would be provided would be based on that, your individual circumstances. So we're always happy to help people and have a chat, so please make contact.
Would it ever be possible in Moreland to have a
Again, not something that I can give a straightforward answer to. I think the example given tonight appears like it was a home on wheels, so if it's a movable structure, then there would be particular requirements. If it wasn't, if it was considered a secondary dwelling on a lot, then that's something that could be possible. So a second dwelling at the back of an existing home is certainly a possibility.